let's switch topics a little bit, talk about kind of the next major update to the thermal guidelines, and that is dealing with high density air-cooled equipment. So many of you may have either read or personally experienced a significant uptick in the thermal design power for CPUs, GPUs, and even in DIMMs. Even memory is running into the scenario now, where in order to get the processing and the compute throughput that end users are demanding, we're going to higher and higher thermal design power to get there with these processors. And what we're running into now is a scenario where the traditional A-class thermal envelopes cannot necessarily support this ITE. The issue is that we've got higher thermal design power. We've got to get rid of that heat. You have to have larger heat sinks within the servers in order to do that. You have to have higher server airflow, and heat rejection through air is delta T times flow rate. And we have a situation where we kind of can't pack that much more airflow through an air-cooled server and the associated heat sinks. There's a physical limitation that's been reached with a lot of this ITE. And so the way to ensure that you can actually continue to cool this with air is you have to lower the inlet air temperatures. So in order to help with this scenario, a new H1 air cooling class has been created. The primary takeaway from this is that the moisture content is unchanged in the recommended and the allowable for H1 relative to the existing air cooling classes. The recommended range, the lower end of the recommended range, is actually still the same. It's 18 degrees centigrade. But the upper range has been dropped from 27C in the A1 to A4 recommended down to 22C. So effectively what we're saying here is go above 22C and you're going to be having some additional difficulties cooling that. On the allowable side, again, the moisture content is unchanged relative to A1, and actually really all of them, but it's been unaffected, the moisture content has. But on the allowable range, you'll note the A1 allowable goes from 15 to 32C, and we're saying from 5 to 25C in terms of the allowable range. Again, giving you the ability to run the inlet air much cooler than you would have with a traditional A1 type scenario. But crucially, the upper end is brought down by 7 degrees centigrade in order to make sure that we can support that scenario. So here is the allowable and recommended range for H1. If we were to overlay this with the A1s, you would see, or the A1 to A4s, you would see that this is a shift to the colder side, particularly when we look at the upper bounds of the recommended and allowable range. Tying back into the previous conversation about airborne contaminants and corrosion rates, there are two separate bounds here. This one here is showing a 70% upper relative humidity on the recommended range. And then here in a high corrosion rate scenario, you're at 50% relative humidity. So one of the challenges that you may observe here is that if you kind of think back to some of the original old school thermal guidelines back 2004, 2008, the recommended and the allowable range is really fairly tight. And the idea of precision temperature and humidity control was very rampant in those days because of how tight the window is. And what you're seeing again here is for this type of H1 equipment, this both the recommended and the allowable range is very, very tight in terms of environmental requirements.